Our speaker today is Ashlie Koehn. She's an undergraduate in economics, environmental studies, and global and international studies. She was recognized in the 2016 KU Chancellor's Report as one of the best of KU. The report covered a variety of faculty, students, community members who are helping to contribute to the mission of KU by contributing, in part, by contributing original research. She's also a Udall and Truman Scholar, and her lecture today concerns a joint research project that she's been conducting together with Professor Dietrich Earnhart.
So, hello everybody. Hope y'all are doing well. Thanks. I just really want to say thank you to CREES for letting me come here and talk today. This is really cool. Also, thank you to Professor Earnhart for mentoring me through this process. So this is broadly what I'm going to be talking about today. But if you don't know very much about economics or about the border hypothesis, that's fine. Like, I'm going to discuss that in length. So no worries. Oh, pointer. Nope. Okay, there we go. All right, so first off, though, I thought I'd start off with a little bit of background. So my research is focused in Central and Eastern Europe during the 1990s. I find this to be a really interesting time and place because a lot of these economies, they were coming out of communism and into capitalism. And they were coming with a lot of environmental issues and baggage that came from their socialist background. There's a lot of this negative environmental heritage stemmed from a few things. So one, a lot of the communist states really emphasized high industry outputs. So things like manufacturing and mining were heavily emphasized in the capitalist economies as opposed to the more Western economies. Also, there was these economic planning committees which really drove the economy. So they set the prices, which distorted the market. So it changed the way demand worked for a lot of these different sectors. Another factor which led to the high environmental issues is the highly subsidized energy. A lot of the a lot of the industry firms required a lot of energy to produce their goods. So the state really heavily subsidized energy. One of the issues was that their energy didn't come from a very clean source. The majority of their energy came from coal. So in Central and Eastern Europe, this ranged, Hungary was on the low end with 40% of their energy coming from coal sources, while in Poland, 95% of the energy there was sourced from coal power plants. So this compounded with very few environmental policies that weren't even established until the 1970s, as well as no property rights. Firms didn't really have anybody to be held accountable to. And this led to a huge wash of pollution in a lot of these countries. As you can obviously see, there's more pollution per person in the Central and Eastern Europe as compared to other countries in OECD. There's 3 times as much water pollution per person. The coal power plants, one of the byproducts of that was a lot of acid rain, which really damaged a lot of forests and rivers and water systems in Central and Eastern Europe. 50% of the lakes in Poland were heavily damaged by acid rain. Also, just as an example, in Poland, 95% of the river water wasn't drinkable because of the byproducts from a lot of firms, from them dumping stuff into the river. And 65% of the river water was so corrosive that industry equipment that was placed within the rivers was just corroded in a relatively short amount of time. So, pretty bad environmental legacy. So, then comes the period between 1989 and 1991, where there's this huge change and shift as the countries become privatized. They switch from communism to capitalism. And there's a lot of different changes. So one, the firm structure itself changes. A lot of the firms prior to this had been state-run, particularly in countries like Romania and Bulgaria. Some of the states like Hungary and Poland, they had some privatization beforehand, but not on this level. So in this like sort of change, there was this huge investment of foreign direct investment, which which allowed Western investors to sort of put their money in a lot of these Eastern European firms, which caused them to become more environmental. There's also a lot of new environmental movements as citizens became more aware of the environmental damage that had taken place over the course of communism, and also the government transparency. So this also mixed in with the drive to join the European Union, led a lot of these Central and Eastern European states to put in place a whole new like wave of environmental regulation and really change how that was structured. Which leads me to the economics part of this. So this is really interesting because these economies were obviously going through a rough time as it was. And then all this new environmental regulation occurred at the same time. So was that environmental regulation good or was it bad? So for the businesses. So from a more traditional economics approach, people see this, if you look onto the left-hand side, as like the costly regulation theorem or hypothesis, if you will. So regulation can be bad. It can like add on costs to the firms. So the firm, if they have a new environmental regulation, they might have to they might have to in place like new technology. They have to train their workers about how to act in a more like environmentally conscious way, which adds on to the overall cost for the firm and leads to decreased profits. Now, there was another really interesting hypothesis, though, that was sort of given around 1995 by an economist named Michael Porter, and he kind of had the opposite idea when it came to it. He said maybe environmental regulation isn't necessarily inherently bad for firms. Maybe environmental regulation can be, in some cases, good for firms and can lead to like higher overall profits. And so his reasoning, which I kind of have laid out here in this nifty diagram, kind of like goes like this. So there's environmental regulation. The way he phrased it was like the environmental regulation has to be done in like the correct way. Like it has to give firms the room to innovate. So, it can't be like too strict or else this might not work. But so there's this environmental regulation which pushes the firms to then innovate. So the firms, they do like research and they look for like new ways and new practices to reduce costs. And then this reduction in costs increases the overall competitiveness on a number of different ways. So it can overall like lead to increased profits. So I thought this would be kind of an interesting place to look at the Porter hypothesis. There's been some evidence for the Porter hypothesis in a lot of mature market settings. Like it's been studied in the United States and a lot of Western European countries, but it hadn't been really like observed in Central and Eastern Europe. So it was like an interesting like new way to look at this sort of debate, if you will. My reasoning for why it might be true comes from one of two different things. So people say that the Porter hypothesis is more likely to be true because of like one of two reasons, or both. So one, there's the first mover advantage. So say country A decides to go forward with like some new environmental regulation. The firms that are within that country are pushed to innovate fast, and then later on when other countries like change their environmental regulations, the prior country has like the comparative advantage, if you will. So they get the jump, if you will, on like the new innovation and making themselves better. So this has been seen in a lot of like Western European contexts. The more likely reason why I thought this was probably be the case, why the Porter hypothesis would hold true in this Central European context, was because of like this low-hanging fruit principle. And that just is like firms don't inherently look for ways to be more efficient unless they're pushed along. So say, for example, CREES, like there's like some sort of environmental regulation of CREES to reduce their energy and their energy consumption. And people leave the lights on. A really like cost-effective, like readily available way, a low-hanging fruit would be to like hang up a few signs that say turn off the lights when you leave the room. And that could reduce your energy consumption to the point like where you've like met the requirements. So similarly, a lot of these firms in like Central and Eastern Europe had been using a lot of energy, and they hadn't really like been like looking for more cost-effective ways to reduce that. So perhaps like there's this sort of effect where once there's regulation starts happening, the prices start going more to market, that companies in turn actually just like start reducing their like as the standards become stricter, there is like signs of profitability rising. So, which brings me to the data. So the data that I was looking at comes from a professor at Portland State University. His name is Dr. Randy Bluffstone. Professor Bluffstone went and and a group from Harvard, they went and surveyed about 2,400 firms in Central and Eastern Europe during 1997. And so they gave them this long survey and asked them questions about their air and their water emissions, the standards that they had to face in those different, in their different aspects in like air and water, the different programs that they were using. The firms that he surveyed came from like what they like to term as like polluting intensive sectors. So like manufacturing, machinery and apparel, and chemicals, and then also mining sectors like oil and gas. The data that he focused on was over like, he asked for numbers like from 1994 and 1997, so he could like see like the change. The data came from these 6 different countries, and the reasoning behind, so if this is hard to read, I'm sorry, it's Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. So a lot of his reasoning for choosing these countries was they were on different like points along their transition to capitalism. So like Poland and Hungary were farther along. They were a lot more privatized because they had been privatizing before the collapse of communism. However, like Bulgaria, Romania, they were still like, further back in the transition process. This is kind of just a layout of like the firms. Like the majority of firms came from Romania. Also, like quite a few Bulgaria, Hungary, Lithuania, and then just a few came from Slovakia. So, which brings me to like the regression analysis. This is just kind of like broadly like the tools that economists use. I thought it might be like a nifty sort of way to see it. So it's a statistical process, and basically like you have 2 different aspects. So say like costs and regulations, and you can compare the 2 to see what the relationship is. So, oh dear, that was supposed to say costs on the y-axis. I'm sorry. So say like you're comparing costs on like the y-axis, and then regulation along the bottom, and then you just like plot out the points. You see as regulation like increases, do costs go up or do they go down? Like on the left, you can see like a positive relationship. So say if there is like, if costs do go up when regulation goes up, then there's a positive one, negative if otherwise. And so this is my tentative results so far. It's mixed.
Actually, just to clarify, so
Yep.
actually we're showing regulation as increasing, as of going from left to right on the bottom of the horizontal axis. But the actual measure of regulation that we're using is actually reversing that. As the standards get higher, regulation is actually getting looser. So just keep that in mind when you interpret the results that Ashley's about to speak to.
Oh yes, thank you.
Yeah, right, so the standards would be how much pollution are you allowed to emit out your smokestack? How much pollution are you allowed to discharge out of some pipe? So air pollution, water pollution. As those standards get higher, they're less binding, they're less stringent. So the regulation's actually getting weaker as the standard goes up.
Yeah. So it's the inverse of this.
Inverse of what's in terms of interpreting the results, right? So
Mhm.
Ashley's gonna show you results. On the left, it shows a positive relationship, so the results would actually, but on the right-hand side, it's actually a negative relationship. But, right, it's the inverse
Yeah.
of what what Ashley's about to show you.
Tricked you.
Yeah.
No, sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. I should have thought about
I
that.
have a question there.
yeah.
When pollution decreases, I mean, the less the pollution, the harder it will be removed. More costly. Now, the regulation is a straight line again, or is that follows this curve universally, or what? Because when you try to get the pollution out, from 99% to 100 will be awfully more difficult than the first 10% or what. And so the regulation is also follows this cavity curve. Or,
You wanna take a first crack?
Sure. So I guess this isn't looking at like maybe like just like one firm as like as okay. So are you thinking about like as one firm or for like for all these firms? For one.
I don't
Okay.
Let's imagine it's one firm.
Let's imagine. Okay, so if we're like imagining it's one firm, then it would be convex like at some point, I'd imagine. But we're looking at a lot of different firms over like one like snapshot in time, and so we're just like looking at the relationship in that point.
May I use the whiteboard?
Oh.
Onto that? I mean, let's see, this
Yeah, sure.
okay, all right?
Yeah.
So I'm gonna see if I'm capturing what your point you're getting at. And this is, right, without this, right, there's no reason to go. So, that's like I'm capturing. Oh, shit. Kind of better. All righty, so, let's think about this. So you're looking at costs, right, that's what you're capturing, and you're thinking costs are gonna be increasing exponentially as, right, so if we had emissions here, emissions or pollution on the horizontal axis, and then cost on the vertical axis. If I believe this is what you're saying is, you start off at some point where you're doing nothing, no abatement, so there's some maximum amount of pollution. And then costs would rise as we move right to left. As we curtail
Yeah.
pollution, the costs are gonna rise, and you're saying it's not gonna be linear, it's actually gonna be exponential. It's gonna start out low, but getting more and more and more and more costly. Is that accurate?
yes, that's what I.
Yep, right, so that would certainly
And-
be true, right, so to squeeze out those last few kilograms of pollution would be much more expensive.
So the regulation adjusts to this, or how?
It could, but honestly, we're actually not attempting to explain how the standard was chosen. It would just be that it was chosen, so that there would have been some amount that would have been set as a legal. Bart, you need better markers.
I'm just so happy to see the news.
And so there'd be some type of, this is the standard that Ashlie is speaking of. So you're right, if the standard was set, well, then here's the inverse, right? At a really high level, regulation would be weak and the cost would be really small. This is according to the costly regulation hypothesis. But as you move the standard further to the right, costs are going up, and you're saying if you keep moving it to the left, those costs are gonna exponentially just skyrocket. Yep. That would be the costly regulation hypothesis, that's becoming more and more expensive. Costs are only gonna rise.
Okay, but how the regulation adjusts to that? That the less and less stringent, or is the regular? Okay, I can
It's- I mean,
answer it.
It's set at some level. Right, and if it was set at a tighter level, so the less pollution was allowed, costs should be higher. According to the standard hypothesis, yes, they would be higher. But where that standard is set, you would like to think that it would be set based on some type of balance. That is to say, we don't like pollution, we want less of it, but to get rid of it is costly. So we weigh the benefits, the
So
costs.
that's what I mean, so when there's some adjustment to it. But I mean, I asked.
The good thing is, it's not necessarily critical to our story, to the story that Ashley's describing. Whatever was said at, was it good for the firm? Did the firms benefit from it or not? Thank you.
Yeah.
Good point.
Is there any other questions before I? Wait, no, it's fun. Okay. So here's like my tentative results so far, and I still have more work to do. I have Slovakia, Lithuania, and Romania. Where you see green is where I propose like there's evidence of the Porter hypothesis. Yellow is inconclusive, and then red is converse to my original hypothesis that there's actually some cases of the cost deregulation hypothesis. So like for example, in Lithuania, costs are so here, as regulation increases, costs are decreasing and revenue is increasing, basically. And you can see that's in both air and in water. And then in Slovakia, for air, it's kind of like inconclusive right now, so I'm going to have to do more research into that. But water is showing like the water standards do have like signs for the Porter hypothesis, while Romania, it's not. So costly regulation theorem. And I had to divide these into 1994 and 1997 for now. So and then here's 1997. So once again, same three countries, a lot more inconclusive. There's a lot of cases for the Porter hypothesis, though, in Lithuania, which is great because it was also showing in like 1994 as well. So I still need to go a lot through like some of this data and see like why I'm getting this inconclusivity. Is that a word? I don't know. It feels like it. It's long. Yeah, but it's interesting at least like to see where this is going. Would anybody like to look at these slides a little bit longer? Okay. But anyway, so that's my conclusion. I think there is some sign for the Porter hypothesis. Once again, there's still more research to be done. And I've been learning a lot through this process, so I'm looking forward to the further research.
Actually, could you go back to 1994 and unpack those results for people? So to give people an example. So in the one's green. So the Porter hypothesis in Slovakia seems to be supported if one looks at water standards. So unpack how you are interpreting those signs.
Okay. So, so in that, in the regression analysis, so let's go back to that. So one of the things that we get from this regression analysis is from like this line, we get a slope from it. So if it's positive, that means there's a positive relationship, negative, negative. So from these results, I'm like seeing that for the cost, it's a positive relationship. So basically costs are going down as regulation increases. In the revenue, I'm seeing that revenue increases when regulation increases. I want to make sure I was saying that right. Okay. So unfortunately, it wasn't so conclusive in Slovakia in like the air category. So I saw that both costs and revenues were increasing when regulation increased. So I don't know what to make of that. I need to go back and do more work with that data. Romania, however, it seemed that costs were increasing when regulation increased and revenues were going down. So that would be evidence for the costly regulation hypothesis. Is that, do you want me to do more?
Yeah, well, tell us more about the revenues, if you could, because you talked most about, we discussed cost much more. Could you tell us more about why revenues would be affected by the Porter hypothesis or the cost of regulation hypothesis?
So revenues would be like affected by the Porter hypothesis for like a number of reasons. So if you remember earlier, I was talking about like low-hanging, well, not low-hanging fruit, but like the first mover advantage would be ideal example of this. So firms, so say like the firms, because they have like this new environmental regulation, they're innovative and maybe like they're ahead of their time because other countries might also like at some later point also have this new environmental regulation. When that happens, maybe like these firms that have been facing this environmental regulation before have a competitive advantage. And sometimes, like even from these situations, a green market kind of arises. So people think as we all know about like these green markets, they pop up. So people like want to buy a green water bottle. So it becomes like a market within itself. And so that in the way that the firm had been pushed beforehand to become more environmentally like sustainable, kind of gives them a competitive advantage for when it actually does become the case or popular, either by environmental standards or by social standards. For the costly regulation hypothesis, though, like say, just playing the devil's advocate to what I just said, maybe a firm. So let's say what would be a good example. So let's say like a firm, perhaps. Like they have to increase their standards and they have to meet like this new, like they have to reduce their water emissions. However, to like reduce their water emissions, they have to put some sort of, they have to like run all of like their like byproducts through some sort of filtration. And that filtration system is really expensive. So that like cost maybe gets added on to the price of their products, which then makes their products less appealing to the consumers, so less people buy it. So maybe that leads to decreased revenues. I mean, that's just one example, I suppose, and there's other cases where it could be seen.
You can imagine, so the actual product itself isn't as attractive. Right. So in order to meet some standard, you have, paper. I mean, we think of recycled paper as being nice and clean now, but when it was first marketed, it was generally speckled with brown pigment, and people didn't like it. They thought it looked cheap. Right. And that would be an opportunity where they were meeting the environmental standard, but the product was not as attractive, and therefore revenues were not as high.
Yes?
Can you put those graphs up again?
I mean, this was just an example of what a regression analysis is. It's not necessarily representative of my data.
That's the question.
Yeah?
So what types of environmental regulations were you looking at? Air, water, was it those two, or is it just across the board regulations?
Air and water. So I have it kind of split up right now, air and water. And then the air can be like broken down further, like they were regulating like SOx and NOx and, further, like for, okay. No, okay, sorry. Oh, okay. They're regulating like different things of like, air quality. And then like, for water, they're regulating different things. Like in a compound.
What SOx and NOx?
SOx comes out of the coal power plants. NOx, what's the best way? Sulfur oxide.
Sulfur oxide and
This works at the Environmental Protection Agency.
Can you give an example of one specific firm in which I don't know if you're going down to that level. You're looking at just data in aggregate, or can you tell the story of one firm, how, there was this regulation and they did this, and then their revenues improved and the cost coefficient went down? I mean, are you able to tell that kind of story about a specific?
I'll answer first, and I'll give the poor answer. Economists don't do that.
Right.
That's what the humanists do. But we do have data, and I don't know if it's confidential in the sense that we're holding it close to our vest. I don't know if we can actually identify who these people are, but we do know more about them. There were a battery of questions that Ashley's been looking at. So what were those battery of questions that were posed?
Oh, it was do they have an environmental programs? I mean, we could see a firm, what sort of firm it was. Were they a chemical manufacturer? And then what were their costs and revenues in 1994 and 1997? How many people did they employ at both of those times? We can see the environmental standards, if they changed and how they changed. It'd be kind of like hard to unpack like a really compelling individual story, though, maybe.
They were asked to identify certain high-profile investments that they had made.
Yeah.
And then it was to say, okay, what was the impact of these investments? Did that cause you, and then there was a battery of questions. Also, they're not well populated in the data set, and we've generally been ignoring them, mostly because Randall Bluffstone told us, said, it's not worth it. I mean, they seemed like good questions to ask for in response to great questions like yours. But for the quantitative analysis, it became too problematic.
Was the data set something that, did you go out and find the data set, or did you create the data set? Did you provide surveys, or was this something that you went out and found?
So when you say you, meaning Ashlie and I?
Yes, or was this a data set that you found that was published by either, the Chamber of Commerce or whatever?
Oh, no. This survey was these surveys were done actually by Professor Bluffstone during in 1997. And so like he collected all the data and.
He hired
a
a
yeah.
firm in every single country to go and what's called enumerate the survey, as these were all face-to-face. It was a survey, there was actually a script, but it was face-to-face. It was saying, tell us how many employees you have at your factory, mark. Tell us how much you emitted in pollution, mark. It was done through the Harvard International, HIID. Harvard
International
Institute for International
Development, yeah.
So,
And it involves a lot of number crunching. Now, do you go by narrow industrial classification in the country, this type of steel industry, that type of steel industry, and then machine or whatever you see? I mean, by industrial branches, or how do you crunch the numbers? Individual industries, or total?
So at present, what have you done, Ashlie?
At present, I've been going by country, but in the future, I'm going to be doing it like en masse, like total. I haven't been doing it by industries because, I don't know if I would have like enough data per industry to really do it. There's like a number of different firms represented, and I don't know if I'd have to go through and double check, but I wouldn't say we would have enough.
We certainly can.
We could.
But the data size would,
And I'm still confused that, I mean, emission, you have a number, you can quantify. But the regulations, how do you quantify the expression regulations?
It's the same metric. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's think about the same metric. So, you're out on Interstate 70. What's the speed limit?
70.
Is it 70?
Yeah.
75 at the most. Right, so 75 miles an hour. That's the speed limit. It's measured in miles per hour. And then you get out on the interstate and you drive according to the same metric. The question is, are you driving at the speed limit? Are you below the speed limit? Or are you above the speed limit? So everything's measured in the same metric. So if you're allowed to produce 75 kilograms, then that becomes your standard. And the question is, do you actually emit 75 kilograms, or are you above or below it?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay, so
It really is meant to be on the same axis.
Okay, I understand.
So, but that's the point that I guess I attempted but clearly failed to convey accurately before. It's the regulation is the inverse of what you generally be thinking of. As we move to the left, emissions are getting tighter. It's like the speed limit going from 75 miles an hour down to 50 miles an hour.
Matt?
This may not be something you have represented in your data set, but I'm curious if you have any instances of maybe a multinational or a company with presences in 2 countries and how regulations impacted them, whether that was the same or different. I don't know if I find many multinationals in the data set.
Oh, that's a great question.
That is a great question.
I don't think we have the ability to link if they're a multinational corporation operating in 2 different countries. And I'm going to guess what you're thinking. There certainly is evidence for this, that firms operating under multiple jurisdictions, need to be different countries, could be different states. There's evidence here in the United States where this happens. Well, here we have a good example right now. General Mills, I believe, just announced that it was going to be reporting content of its genetically modified organisms in its food. Why? Because Vermont is about to impose that law. And General Mills said we're just going to comply across the board. So they comply in Vermont, but they're over compliant in the other 49 states. Could that have happened here? Possibly. That's a really good question. Ashlie, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it'd be really interesting. I'll have to look into it more. Sorry, and you have a question?
Yeah, my question is probably related to Matt's question. Was it considered in your questionnaire the database whether it's a brand new company or just an old Soviet socialist company which just changed hands? And what the relations were versus new company which is probably absent from the regulations?
I believe that all of the firms represented in the data were in existence in 1990. Like,
Not considering that.
not
So
considering
that may explain to maybe the Slovakia phenomenon. Maybe they're just country differences so how they were complying with the Comic-Con world.
Well, one thing we could look at is like the percentage of like still like public holdings like in 1997.
We do have information on their ownership,
Yeah, we do have ownership information.
but at least in terms of the crude sense of whether or not they're state-owned or privately owned. Yeah, I agree with Ashlie. I think whether Randy Bluffstone and his colleagues meant to do this, but they seem to have selected only factories that were operating as of 1990. And it's a really good point. I mean, we have that information about what they were doing in 1990, so we could just screen on that and say, okay, for all those people who were operating in 1990, they go into the analysis. Then we're comparing apples to apples. That's a good point.
Question that kind of relates to that, but it's a snapshot. It doesn't capture whether firms completely went out of business, like somebody closed their doors potentially as a result of not being able to meet environmental standards.
Okay, that can't be our reviewer.
Yeah.
Right, so the point is okay, sorry.
No.
We have a selection bias. That is, we only observe the firms who stuck it out. Right, so for those firms for whom the regulation was crushing, we don't got them. So we have a biased estimate of the impact on regulation. There could be the regulation works like a charm. They lower their costs, increase their revenues, everybody's happy. For all those people for which it was reversed, they're culled from our herd. And that's a really good point. All right, well, here's the caveat, right? This is an upper bound estimate on the impacts. Things could, upper bound or lower bound? Oh, things could be worse. But that's true. Good point. Yep.
Yes.
So there's data for all of the countries, right? So why did you select Slovakia over Romania?
Oh.
Supposed to be a nice audience.
Well, a lack of sufficient data.
Central Europe, Lithuania is kind of the Baltic Republic, Romania is Southern Europe. I could see that type of argument. Was there some other reason?
Lack of sufficient data.
Pardon?
A lack of sufficient data. Unfortunately, within our data set, there was a lack of sufficient data. Like the Polish firms didn't really answer the question of what their standards were. So, tough break. I really wish I could see it, but I don't know. Perhaps like we could use emissions as a proxy, but
I'm not criticizing, I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were trying to be sneaky. We're trying to pull one off.
No, if the data's not there for the other countries, it's not there, right? And
Yeah.
with this,
Well, you guys are nicer than most economists.
No.
Can I ask about just the mechanics of this? Like, what program were you using in order to analyze this? How did you go about the research process?
So mainly I've been using statistical analysis software, so SAS. For these regressions, I had to use Excel because the SAS on my computer wasn't working when I was trying to do it. So yeah, I can like run regression analysis on Excel or on SAS. SAS is generally better because then later on people can go back and they can see what you did. and make sure he didn't make any errors. So I'm going to be redoing this all in SAS when I get it fixed.
Sounds like the program is a little too sassy, right?
Yeah,
Bad
that was great. That was,
joke. Sorry, that's a bad joke.
yeah.
Does your analysis depend on the assumption that regulations are enforced consistently everywhere or equally consistently? Like, could part of the variability come from regulations in one country maybe not being enforced as strictly as in others, even if they're on the books?
We have like the data also like for like how often they say that they are like regulated, like how often like do visitors come and inspectors come. So maybe I could like add that on as well.
Almost control for that then.
Yeah,
Like, we can get inspections or something.
definitely. So I think I'll probably do that too.
Actually, that's a good point. Actually,
Yeah.
a manuscript under review at a journal right now that poses that question, that you could think of regulation coming in two forms. That is, what's on the books, so the
Yeah.
de jure versus the actual de facto, what's actually on the ground. Previous studies, not there have only been two, show that the inspections pressure is that doesn't matter, but the evidence that right now is under review is indicating that it could matter under certain combinations. When the limits or standards are really tight, so they're far to the left, then you could imagine that the amount of monitoring does matter.
Well, I wonder too if there are differences across the kind of industry or the kind of pollution too. Like, is and I'm not an environmental scientist by any means, but like, is water pollution easier to measure than air pollution? You know, like, is there something there too,
That's a
or easier to enforce standards of?
That's an interesting question because like one of the sectors that actually is also included in this data set is like animal, factory like farms. And so that's kind of like hard to measure, like factory farms, like how much they pollute.
I mean, the other pollutants, the pollutants that are measured here are your standard pollutants you're going to find anywhere in the United States, Western, Eastern, Central Europe. They're easily monitored. They would have been easily monitored decades ago. So that's not a point. But it certainly brings up the bigger point that, going back to, so the actual outcomes that Ashley's trying to explore in terms of do costs and revenues change. You could certainly imagine that people get constrained on their SOx, or the sulfur dioxide, and they can respond to that in a very innovative way, but then they get constrained on their NOx, the nitrogen oxides, and that is actually a struggle for them. So that to do the analysis, you could break it out so that every single pollutant has its own impact on costs and revenues. It muddies the waters in the sense that now rather than having, poor Ashley, she already has 4 results that she has to show and interpret. Then she actually multiply that by 8, so she'd have 32. And then there'd be a lot of yellow up there. But we could do it. Let's do it.
Sounds like a research grant.
These are great questions.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah.
Do you have a hypothesis of why Lithuania showed
Not yet. Yeah. I don't know. I think that there's like a lot, like there's like a really like big like there's a big environmental like movement in Lithuania, like for pressing for new like environmental like goods, and so maybe like Lithuanians were like supporting their businesses in such a way that it helped like the firms to find like these extra hidden benefits that are given by the Porter hypothesis. But there's a lot of like these nuancey things that I really want to like explore and like dig deeper into, because it's really interesting that it's showing up there. So
Here's where the more humanistic analysis would be really helpful, is to get a better appreciation of what was the context, what attitudes, the perspectives that these different countries brought to the table, and how would that have been reflected in. At the end of the day, this is business management. How do businesses approach these issues? Lithuania could have a more cooperative, flexible attitude, perspective. Where in, what was it?
Romania.
Romania, right, it's a bad attitude, right? Very recalcitrant. Sclerotic, that's always my favorite word for describing these economies, sclerotic.
Is there any other questions?
And well timed. Your feedback is well
Oh.
timed. I think this is the time when you pose all these great ideas of how we can slice up the data, and we have it, and we will. All right, so we'll come back in a year.
Thank you both for coming in and sharing your
Thank you.